There's a reason a shortcut through gravestones feels longer at night. Tonight, we're going to walk it together, slowly, and I promise, by the time we reach the mausoleum, you'll be checking the locks on your doors. Before we begin, these are reported encounters, eyewitness accounts, sometimes backed by recordings or matching memories, sometimes not. I'm not here to prove ghosts. I'm here to tell you what people have lived through, how those moments lodge themselves in the dark and refuse to let go. Also, don't go trespassing. Respect the dead and stay legal. If you want to read more on these cases, links are in the description. Quick note before the first story. This episode is brought to you by Nightlight, a small company making motion-sensing exterior lights that don't just switch on, they ease the way home. I'm not paid to tell you how to be brave at night, just to make sure you can see where you're stepping. They give listeners a discount code in the description if you want to light up that shortcut without having to invite anything weirder than a raccoon. 1. The smiling woman who sat on the bed. Microhook. He woke paralyzed, and she was smiling like someone who knew the ending. It was 20 minutes past midnight when a college freshman, call him Jake, rolled over in his tiny dorm room and found his limbs were not his. The room smelled like cheap detergent and the faint, familiar, oily tang of an old heater. Streetlights bled through the blinds in horizontal slashes. His phone, face down, the roommate's TV flickered from the next room. He tried to breathe. He couldn't make his body obey. At the foot of Jake's bed, when none of the furniture should have been, she sat. A woman in a plain white dress with a small, unreadable smile. Her hair hung in a damp, uneven curtain. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers laced. She did not speak. She tilted her head, curious, as if watching a small animal deciding whether to trust a hand. Jake later wrote that he felt an awful, benign attention, as if someone was studying the way he feared. He described pressure on his chest, a taut ribbon around his throat that did not choke but made him acutely aware of his heartbeat. The minutes stretched and collected into new shapes, seconds like pebbles. After he finally flung an elbow free, the one move that always seems to work in these stories, the woman was gone. He screamed for his roommate, but the light was still horizontal across the blinds, and the TV still left its blue wash. Jake couldn't sleep again for most of the week. He started waking suddenly at 3 or 4 a.m., convinced the room had gained another presence. He told his father about the figure, and, to Jake's surprise, his father didn't laugh. "When I was a kid," he said, "I woke up and there was a woman at the foot of my bed, smiling. I thought I was dreaming." They compared the details, the same smile, different dresses, the same pressure at the throat. Two people, years apart, who used the same corners of language to describe the same impossible thing. Reported details like the smile and the throat pressure fit a pattern many listeners call sleep paralysis. It's a state where your mind wakes before your body, and people often report figures, sensations, or even feelings of being watched. That doesn't make the experience less terrifying, it just gives one possible way to talk about it. Jake never took a shortcut through a graveyard that led to his dorm. He lived on campus. But the night grew a little longer for him after that first visit. He kept a small lamp on after that. The light made the dark manageable. The fear, it turned out, learned how to sit beside him. 2. The cousin who had the same dream. Microhook. Two people, two beds, one memory that crossed miles overnight. My cousin, Emma, messaged me at 3 a.m., all caps and trembling punctuation. She'd been at her boyfriend's for the weekend, and they'd all fallen asleep on a couch after a movie. She said she woke in a cold sweat and saw a pair of hands reach down toward the sleeping bodies in the dim blue light. I'm not the kind of person to forward chainmail, but this next part made my chest tighten. At the same hour, her cousin across town woke up with the same dream, the same reaching hands, and the same sense that someone, or something, had been examining them like specimens. Emma told me it felt personal, like the hands were deciding whether to take something. Her cousin called the next day, voice shaken. Both of them kept circling the same image, A woman with long black hair, face obscured, smiling without malice but without warmth. Both felt a pressure at the throat that was heavier in the memory than in the dream. The thing to note here is how these accounts feed on each other. Two separate people reporting similar, specific details suggests either shared psychology, talk, suggestion, the contagiousness of fear, or something stranger, a slippage between minds at night. Both possibilities are reported in paranormal communities. Both leave the people who lived through it with the same late-night residue, a reluctance to sleep on their backs, a new habit of crossing their arms over their throats like tiny shields. A friend of mine who studies folklore once said that some stories spread like a cold, fast, quiet, and then everybody seems to have it. Whether contagion explains these nightmares or not, what's left afterwards is not an argument. It's insomnia, awkward silence between family members, and the unease of telling someone you love that the nights have changed. 3. The bride in the photographs. Microhook. A family album and a face that wasn't supposed to be there. This one is older, told to me by my great-aunt who received the tale from her mother, make of that what you will, but it's precise in the way older stories often are. In the late 1940s, in a Midwestern town with a church steeple and a single diner, a man found an envelope of prints in his late cousin's attic after the funeral. The photos were of a wedding, a vein of laughter, the bride and groom, relatives leaning into the frame like they'd always been there. Except, in the background of 3 consecutive images, behind a tree and almost like a shadow, there was a woman in a white dress, smiling directly at the camera. Her dress looked slightly older than the bridal fashions in the photo. Sometimes you could see the lace. Sometimes the sun bleached it until it was only a suggestion. Several family members said they had never seen her at the wedding. One cousin recognized the face, an older relative's cousin who died young and been buried in the town cemetery years earlier. After the discovery, the man who'd found the photographs reported small things. Late-night footsteps outside his window, the sense of being watched while he walked the dog during the long summer twilight. He moved the pictures to a drawer and rarely spoke of them. The family, on the other hand, split between those who thought the woman had somehow been captured and those who thought it was a trick of exposure, an artifact of developing techniques. Both possibilities were whispered over coffee. The family's testimony included a later twist. A cousin said that after the photos surfaced, she dreamed of the same smiling bride every night for a week. In the dreams, the bride would stand at the lip of a cemetery path and beckon. No one in the family rushed to the graveyard to find out what beckoning meant in the air. They left it to the living. 4. The mausoleum playback. Microhook. They found nothing at the time until they listened in the car. Mausoleums are their own kind of theater. Stone corridors, marble like frozen water, names cut deep and precise. This story comes from a small crew that spent an evening at a historic cemetery's mausoleum, a place with an old chapel and brass plaques, recording, poking, and cracking open the stale air with flashlights. They were young, curious, and careful. They did not break anything, they said, just walked the permitted paths until the night felt thick. One of them recorded audio with a handheld recorder for 30 minutes, mostly idle observations, wind, their own ankles on gravel, and occasional muffled car. When they played the file back in the car afterward, parked with the heater up and the tape between them like a small confession, they said they heard something they had not noticed live, a whisper, low and clear, that sounded a lot like someone saying, "Go on, go," or, if you prefer another plausible hearing, "No one." They checked the timestamps. The whisper appears at a point when the recordist had stopped talking and the ambient noise dropped. On a spectrograph, the friend who knows how to make these things look meaningful pulled it up, there is a narrow human-like waveform. The crew swore they had been alone. One of them later printed a still of the waveform and stuck it by his monitor. When they went back during the day to show family members and skeptics, nothing occurred. The mausoleum was sunlit and quiet. People who live in the neighborhood told them stories of people who swore they heard voices in the empty stone. One elderly woman said, "You hear things there. It has ears." Whether the playback was a misheard wind or something layered into the stone, the recording became a hinge in these people's lives. They felt validated enough to return, but not so validated that they felt safe. 5. The house that listened. Microhook. A family moved in and discovered the house still kept memories. A homeowner on the edge of town reported that moving into a house near the cemetery came with an unwelcome soundtrack. At first, it was little things. The faint echo of conversation on the other side of the bedroom wall, like people in a distant hallway. A pattern of footsteps in the attic that would pause when anyone reached for the light. He thought it was pipes or settling floorboards, until his daughter woke up screaming about whispers that wanted her to come outside. They began to notice distinct phrases repeated at odd hours. Everyday phrases that would thread through dreams and then echo in waking rooms. The family said they often heard the same line, "Don't forget the flowers." It would slip through the thin walls, immediate and insistent, and then fade like a radio cutting out. On several mornings, the daughter would wake with an ache in her forearm, small, bruise-like shadows that appeared without clear cause. Neighbors said the property used to belong to a florist who tended a small plot of land beside the cemetery, who had died years before. Whether the house kept memories of what had been there, the smell of earth, the touch of hands, is another way to tell this kind of story. The homeowner tried to record the sounds with a baby monitor and captured little more than static and a faint murmur that could almost be speech. He posted a snippet to a local forum. People argued about acoustics and the power of suggestion. Psychological after-effects are part of this story's anatomy. The family slept with all lights on for a long time. The daughter complained of hearing the murmured phrase even while awake, as if her ears had adopted the house's language. Friends who visited asked why they did not simply move. The answer was small and practical and human. They had roots there, a lease, a dog. Sometimes the dead, if they linger, do not have to be violent to be disruptive. A place that listens and responds, even in whispers, makes daily life sharper at its edges. If you're enjoying these so far and you want more, hit subscribe. There are new deep dives into strange encounters every week. Interlude. It's easy to think of these things as isolated flickers, but notice the thread, attention. Whether it's a woman watching from the foot of a bed, a whisper on a playback, or a house carrying the cadence of an old life, the common quality is focus. The living are being observed in mundane moments, waking, packing, walking. That attention changes how a person perceives their nights. It tightens the ordinary into something watchful. I want you to sit with that for a second before we step back into the cemetery. Imagine a single presence, patient as tidewater, waiting for the same hour each night. Some of the tales ahead get louder, chase scenes and bright apparitions, and some go inward, small and corrosive. Next time, we begin with a construction worker who mistook a shadow for a person and ended up running for his life. But before I pull you back over the gate, a note on safety. These stories are told from people who claim to have experienced them. None of this is meant to encourage trespassing or dangerous night visits to cemeteries. If you're curious about these places, go in daylight. Honor the living and the dead. Now keep your coat on. We're about to move from nights in beds and shadowed houses to open fields and the kind of white figure people tell you to run from. 6. The tall white figure the construction worker couldn't lose. Microhook. He mistook a tall shadow for a man until it kept catching up with his headlamp. It was the kind of night that makes asphalt smell like old pennies, cold, with a thin rain that kept the lights on the highway smeared into long coins. A construction crew was finishing a late shift on the perimeter of a new subdivision where the land still fell away into the cemetery like a wound in the hillside. Caleb, 30, weathered hands, a laugh that came loud enough to wake coyotes, was the last man pouring concrete by the retaining wall. He had his headlamp on, the cone of light cutting a tunnel through the fog that rolled off the stone markers. He saw something across the plots. At first it looked like a stray worker, a figure in a pale jacket standing among the stones. Caleb waved, called out a half-joking, "You lost, buddy?" When the silhouette didn't answer and the night swallowed his voice, he assumed the man had heard him and would move along. But then the shape, tall, too tall, shifted in a way mouths don't. It didn't walk. It glided with the slow inevitability of tide. The white seemed fabric, but stretched into lengths that would not belong to any human shoulder. He took a step toward the gate. The thing closed the distance. Caleb quickened his pace. It matched him. He tried a run. The headlamp bounced, gravel kicked up. The figure kept pace like a patient second shadow. When Caleb finally reached the road, the figure paused at the last plot, silhouetted against the wet stones. He looked back from the van and saw the pale column straighten like a curtain being ironed. It did not move again. That night, Caleb could not sleep. He told the foreman at dawn, and the foreman laughed until he saw Caleb's hands, which had gone white around fingernails. A neighbor later said he had seen a sheet of light in the cemetery 2 nights in a row, standing still as a fence post. The more practical explanations came fast. Headlight glare, rain reflections, exhaustion. But Caleb described a particular quality. The thing seemed to select him with a deliberateness that was almost gentle, like a sentinel choosing who it would follow. He quit the night shifts for months. In the weeks that followed, he woke sweating, convinced that something tall and pale was watching him from the corner of his bedroom, waiting for him to put on boots. The crew joked that he had been scared straight, but when a neighbor's teenage son walked home late and later told his mother he had seen a pale person among the stones, the jokes thinned into quieter, more careful questions. Everyone who reported it used the same word, white, but none of them insisted on what that white was, cloth, light, or bone. It remained for them a white that kept its distance and yet kept coming. 7. The Otisville sheets and floating orbs. Microhook. They thought it was laundry hung wrong, until the sheets lifted and the lights started following. Otisville is mostly ordinary, the sort of town with a single main street and a cemetery that backs up to a thicket of maples. Late one October, a couple, Lena and Marco, moved into an old farmhouse on the cemetery line. They loved the place for its porch and for the way the frost lit the fields at dawn. On their second week there, while trimming the hedges, they began to notice something odd. Around dusk, when the fog pooled low, pale sheets would appear draped over stones in the older section, like laundry lines no one had hung. At first, they assumed pranksters, kids with white sheets and nothing better to do. But the sheets were too symmetrical, too perfectly placed, and they were silent. They didn't cold shoulder the wind. They held in place as if pinned from below. Then, on a night when Lena went to take a phone photo, an act more of curiosity than fear, the sheets lifted a hair's breadth off the ground and drifted together, like ghosts that had learned to swim. Around them, small pinpricks of light, orb-like and cool as breath, moved with apprentice curiosity. The lights hovered, moved in tight circles, and then shot upward, disappearing into the black. A neighbor teenager posted a shaky video to a local group. A pale rectangle passing between stones, a small bright dot floating just above it like a moth. People argued in the comments about bugs and camera artifacts. But 2 older women who'd lived in Otisville for decades described the same phenomenon in the 70s, when a different part of town was young and the cemetery was wider. They look like lanterns, one said, but they are not lanterns. They pause like birds with decisions to make. The couple began to hear soft, fabric-like rustling at the window on late nights. Marco, who worked early shifts, swore he saw an orb glide across the lawn and then pause at the bedroom window as if considering whether to come inside. On tape, Lena managed to catch a faint, high swell, less a voice and more the suggestion of breath. The experience left them unsettled, not because they felt threatened, but because the place they had chosen for quiet mornings had decided to move and to watch. They installed motion lights and left them on for a spell. Whatever had been dancing among the stone monuments respected the light boundary for a time, as if it didn't like to trespass into mechanical brightness. The sheets, when photographed during the day, were found to be nothing more than cloth draped over small temporary markers, practical and mundane. But at night, the shapes reassembled. Many in town took to saying, almost apologetically, that the cemetery had moods. Sometimes it was sleepy, sometimes hungry for attention. The more pragmatic shrugged and named shadows. The rest of them learned to lock their doors a little earlier. 8. The giant shadow of Kazakhstan. Microhook. A teen saw a shadow taller than the electricity poles, moving without a body to throw it. This one came from a listener who grew up outside a small city in Kazakhstan, where the wide steppe makes night feel deeper because there are fewer lights to break it. He wrote in careful English and attached a photograph of a field at dusk. Nothing extraordinary, he said, but the story that followed stayed in a tone between distress and disbelief. He was 17 and returning from a late music practice with friends. The path home cut across a municipal cemetery with a low fence and a gate that was usually closed. That night, the gate was open. The sky was hard and cold. In the middle distance, across the graves, he saw something fall that had no source, a shadow, earlier than its maker. It descended from the sky like a black drawstring, widening as it neared the ground until it towered higher than the electricity poles along the road. It moved like a long animal, not walking but streaming, as if someone had poured ink across the earth and gravity was dragging it forward. The teen felt his breath go flat. The shadow did not have edges one could trace. It had the quality of a sleeve turned inside out. As it passed over the graves, animals fled. Dogs in nearby yards howled and then stopped, as if even their barks had surrendered. The boy said he felt a pressure behind his eyes and a pull at the base of his skull, as if the shadow wanted him to narrow his focus and forget everything else. He ran. He ran with the teenage energy of someone who expects to be teased for superstition tomorrow, but who cannot today afford that risk. He made it to his house and slammed the door, and later that night he woke in a sweat, convinced the shadow had entered his room and stood at the foot of his bed, its coolness damp on the sheets. His grandmother, a woman who'd seen more winters than the rest of the family, said she remembered stories of a steppe shade her own father had warned about, a thing of bad weather and long sorrow. Whether folklore was framing the memory or the memory was feeding the folklore is the kind of loop that keeps these tales breathing. Years after, another listener from the same town wrote in to say she had seen the same phenomenon as a child, only smaller and nearer the river. The repetition across time and place didn't prove anything, of course, but for those who'd seen it, the shadow was a presence with a long memory and a strange courtesy. It never seemed to strike, only to pass, and those in its path were left with a new caution about walking alone on nights when the air felt like paper. 9. The vanishing hood and the teen who took a picture. Microhook. A photo should have shown a face, but the face was missing. A group of teenagers dared each other to walk the old Victorian section of town cemetery at midnight. It was a rite of passage thing, equal parts bravado and boredom. One of them, Maya, had a phone and a pocket full of teenage certainty. She took pictures on the way, giggling through the weeds, calling the rest of them cowards when a fox startled them, and bounding off to prove she was not afraid. Near the oldest plot, between two leaning monuments, someone pointed out a figure in a hooded cloak standing beside a tree. The teens froze. The figure didn't approach or retreat. It just existed, a vertical negative in the world that didn't quite have a face. Maya, reckless and furious at being shown up, pressed the camera button. The flash cracked the night, quick and too eager, and the hooded figure stepped back, then slipped, and this was the worst part, sinkable like fog. In the photo, the hood remained, sure as fabric, but the space inside was the color of nothing. They ran. The one who'd insisted on the dare claimed later that when they looked back, the hood hung in the air for a second and then dropped, like a coat tossed on a chair. One of the boys came home and found a crescent-shaped mark on his wrist, pale as toothpaste, which he couldn't explain. The group fractured into believers and scoffers. The photo went around social feeds with the comments dividing into memes and earnest threads arguing about exposure and shutter lag. Months later, Maya reported recurring dreams of hands cupping an empty hood, trying to coax a face into being. She said it felt like a waiting room for a face to remember it belonged to a person. Some friends said she had invented the dreams to keep the story alive. Others watched the way she crossed streets now. She never walked alone past the old cemetery. 10. The giant dog in the field. Microhook. A shape the kids called a dog turned out not to be anything familiar. This one is an odd, small-town sort of terror. Not elegant, not neat, just a bruise on the memory of a summer. Two brothers, Sam and Eli, were playing soccer in the wide green field beside the new housing tract that bordered the cemetery. It was early evening, the kind of summer light that makes everything a little softer. They had goals made of sticks and a dog-eared ball. When the ball rolled under a clump of scrub, the boys went after it. Halfway to the scrub, they stopped, breath caught, because there was a shape there that was all wrong for the place. A dog, yes, but bigger than a farm truck if you could imagine such a thing. It had too much shoulder, and its head seemed too heavy for its neck, as though someone had scaled up a normal dog and forgotten the physics. Its eyes were not reflective. They were matte and wet, like two puddles of night. The animal did not bark. It stared. When it moved, it did not bound. It stalked, a slow, inexorable dilation across the grass. The boys ran. The dog followed, keeping the same slow pace, closing with a patience that was obscene for a hound. Their mother saw them burst through the back door, breathless, and when she turned to see where they'd been running from, the field was empty. The police later checked the area for stray dogs and found nothing. The younger brother woke with nightmares for months, dreams where a giant paw pressed beside his bed, cold as river stones. In the mornings, he would sometimes find shallow indentations in the lawn near the scrub, like someone had pressed a large hand into earth, and then the marks faded by noon. The family moved a year later, not in panic, but because the field was a daily reminder that the ordinary world can be interrupted by something disproportionate and patient. Interlude B. A quiet technical aside. People have asked for a sober word about recordings and sleep phenomena, and it's fair. EVPs, those faint noises people say they capture on digital recorders, are usually just that, faint. They can be shaped by expectation, by the ear's natural desire to find patterns, and by acoustic chance. Likewise, sleep paralysis is a state where your mind wakes while your body hasn't yet gotten the memo to move. People commonly report impressions of figures and pressure. Neither category settles the argument between the natural and the uncanny. They are tools for talking about experience, not answers. Consider them clues, not proof. 11. Voices over the water at the USS Arizona Memorial. Microhook. He recorded nothing in the moment, then the water spoke on playback. The memorial at the Arizona sits half in and half above the water, a slab of white intent against a harbor that remembers. Priya laughed at first, a nervous sound, but the laugh died in her mouth. Noah felt his knees go hollow. Then the shimmer leaned in, not toward their faces, but toward the space between them, as if it wanted to sit in the place they'd left open when they trusted each other. The hair on their arms prickled. For a second, they heard a sound like cloth being dragged over stone. Then the shimmer folded back and retreated along the path, dissolving into the graveyard, leaving the night as if nothing had happened. Afterward, the two of them reported the same odd physical residue, a numbness along their shoulders, like frostbite without frost, and a shared dream in which they were both standing on opposite sides of a river and could not reach each other because something thick and unseen kept them apart. They didn't return. They told friends in hushed, embarrassed tones, as if admitting fear was a confession. People who heard the story took their side, depending on how much they wanted the world to be full of ordinary explanation or open to darker margins. 13. The narrow mist that followed Matt's house. Microhook. A ribbon of fog threaded the backyard and found its way into the kitchen, tasting the salt of the table. Matt lived with 3 roommates in a bungalow whose backyard leaned on an old municipal cemetery. On late summer nights, they ate on the porch and smoked, the television light bleeding through the kitchen window. One night, around midnight, a long, narrow column of mist rose from the cemetery and followed the footpath to the porch steps. It paused at the threshold, like a cat choosing a lap. They joked at first. "Neighborhood fog," one said. Matt captured a short video because he liked recording small, weird things that seemed to make a house feel like the set of a film. The mist crept along the siding and seeped under the back door, where it moved through the kitchen like a hand looking for something to warm. Matt's girlfriend swore she felt it pass between her legs as she stood by the sink, a cool brush against the skin. The room smelled for a moment of river clay and old pennies. Later, Matt found a thin ring of dampness on the kitchen table, as if a tall glass had been there and was no longer. He wiped it away, but the friends then started reporting small annoyances. The dog refusing the backyard at night, a clock stopping for 10 minutes, a door that would not latch until they shut it hard twice. One roommate took it as a sign to move to a brighter part of town. Another, who grew up near graves, suspected the mist knew names and was in search of one. On the local neighborhood forum, someone wrote, "The cemetery breathes sometimes." Others argued about humidity and temperature inversion. For the people who felt the mist, the experience remained intimate and bodily. It visited like a memory, close enough to be smelled, gone before it could be fully explained. That kind of visitation leaves a residue not of fear, but of discomfort, as if your house has learned a new guest and you have to accept you might never fully know what it wants. 14. The colonial soldier at the locked gate in India. Microhook. They expected an empty gate and found an old uniform standing at attention. 2 friends visiting an historic cemetery tucked behind a colonial-era administrative compound in India found the gate locked, as it often is after sunset. They leaned on the iron bars, chatting about the day's markets, when one of them whispered, "Look." On the other side, near a cluster of banyan trees, a faint, upright figure stood facing the gate. The uniform, if that's what it was unmistakable: a faded khaki jacket, a brimmed hat tilted just so, and boots that seemed to sink never quite into the ground. They had the good sense not to force the gate open. Instead, one of them took a photograph through the bars. When they checked the picture on the phone, the figure was there, a trace in the frame. In the photo, mist bunched around the boots like a small cloud. When they enlarged the image, a few darker smudges suggested rank insignia. The men who had been stationed in that compound during the colonial period were long gone, and the cemetery beyond the gate held stories of men who had been young and then not. The friends showed the photo to a local shopkeeper who had lived her whole life near the compound. She nodded slowly and said, "Sometimes the old watchman returns in his uniform. He checks the gate. He asks if everything is in order." Her voice was practical, as if this was the most ordinary kind of paperwork. She added that when she was a child, her grandmother had warned her not to tease the dead because they returned in the clothes they'd left the world wearing. The photograph circulated among the friends and across a travel blog. Skeptics suggested a double exposure, a trick of light, or a tourist in costume. Others pointed out the historical accuracy of the uniform's cut and the way the figure's posture matched known drill manuals. For the 2 friends who'd leaned on the iron bars that night, the encounter was quiet and formal, a salute without sound. It stuck in their memories not because it terrified them, but because it felt like someone keeping a promise to keep watch even when there was no reason left to do so. 15. Footsteps behind the brother who fished and the friend who couldn't shake a presence. Microhook. He heard steps on the bank when no one was there. Later, a friend said something small and terrible. It's followed me home. A brother, call him Daniel, liked to fish at dusk in the little inlet by the old churchyard. It was his way of talking to the world with a reel instead of words. One evening, as he sat on the bank, he heard the soft, measured sound of footsteps on the gravel behind him. He turned. Nothing. The air smelled of wet wood and algae. He shrugged it off as someone on a walk.
But the steps came again, close enough that the reeds shushed them into focus. He stood, half expecting to see a neighbor. The bank was empty. The only sound was the low plop of his bait hitting the water. Over the next weeks, the steps grew regular in his nights, always at the same time, always the same cadence. Once, he woke to them in his apartment, pacing outside his bedroom door, stopping, resuming. His sister swore she heard them too, and once sat at the top of the stairs listening while the sounds circled the house. There were no footprints, no explanation, only the sense of being followed by the small, polite tread of something that did not hurry. Around that time, a friend, Asha, visited the cemetery for reasons that had nothing to do with dares. She had come with offerings at a family grave. Afterward, she reported weeks of feeling watched in crowds, a low hum at the edge of conversation. "It's like company," she said to Daniel. "Not noisy, not mean, just present. At first, I thought I had misread the air. Now I keep catching myself apologizing when I walk past an empty bench." She laughed when she said it, but there was a tiredness under the laugh. Both of them, Daniel with his footsteps and Asha with her sense of unasked-for company, felt the psychological residue these experiences leave. Small anxieties that rearrange the margins of life. Daniel would fish less often. Asha began to sleep with a lamp on. Friends suggested practical remedies. Change your routine, change your space. But the changes were less about escaping and more about negotiating. People learn to live with the things they can't explain by building new habits around them. There's an odd intimacy to these endings. Footsteps slow to a stop. A presence that is more companion than predator. In many tales from cemeteries, the world doesn't always end in confrontation. Sometimes it ends in a kind of hush that teaches you how to live differently, with the small knowledge that you share your days with things that may or may not belong to the world you think you own. Closing reflection. We began tonight with the small, private terror of the woman at the foot of a bed, and wandered through a landscape of white figures, recorded whispers, oversized animals, and formal salutes at locked gates. The threads that tie these stories together are not proof of anything so tidy as ghosts, but they form a pattern you can feel: attention, repetition, and persistence. Whether it's a playback that suddenly contains a voice, a photograph that steals a face, or the echo of steps that never leave a print, the cemetery stories return to the way the living perceive their nights after something unexpected arrives. Think about that word, attention. These reported events are rarely dramatic hauntings meant to terrorize. More often, they are quiet fixations, presence holding its focus on a person, a porch, a routine. That kind of attention is both intimate and invasive. It changes how someone closes a door, how a child sleeps, how a teenager tells the story later with the nervous pride of having survived something named and unnamed. We do not arrive at conclusions. We arrive at consequences. Insomnia, new locks on doors, a reluctance to walk alone at certain hours, and a steady, human tendency to look for explanations. One more practical line, because listeners text me this. These stories are reported encounters. If curiosity draws you to cemeteries, go in daylight, respect the grounds, and observe local rules. Do not trespass. Do not break anything. These places deserve the same measure of reverence we give to the memories they hold. If you stayed this long and found yourself hungry for more, there are a few bonus accounts and sound files in the description for patrons. Quiet, unadorned recordings beyond what we played here. If you liked tonight, subscribe for more long-form walks into the dark. And if you want to help keep this channel ad-free and deeper, the link to behind-the-scenes posts and extra stories is down below.
Final image and sign off. At the end of the night, when the last porch light clicks off and the road folds itself back under the dark, cemeteries do not stop being places of memory. They are places where attention collects. They are places that, some nights, listen back. So lock the gate, turn the key, and remember, if you think you hear footsteps behind you when no one is there, you might already be keeping an appointment with someone who never fully left. Good night. Watch your back.